Good Monday morning, and thanks for listening to my musing this week about stories, specifically the stories that we tell ourselves. There is a person that was helpful to me thinking about stories whose name is Joseph Campbell. Maybe you remember from years ago there was an interview between Bill Bryson and Joseph Campbell on the power of myth. And why do we need myths to help us understand who we are? Some people take a bad sense from the word myth, that it's a made-up story, it's a fable, it's a children's tale, and it has no grounding in reality. That's not necessarily what Joseph Campbell means by myth. A myth is simply a story that makes us, which is why paying attention to stories is so important. As people of faith, as Christians, as Protestants, we pride ourselves on being people of the book. That the Bible in the Old Testament and the New Testament tells us something about who we are and who we're supposed to be. But the Bible isn't the only story or the only myth that makes us. We have American myths. We have family myths. These stories, whether historical or ahistorical, that shape the ways we think about ourselves. The best example I have of this is The Wizard of Oz. In every story, there's generally a protagonist and an antagonist. In The Wizard of Oz, we have the innocent girl, Dorothy, who stands in for all innocence, thrown into a situation outside of her control. We have the wizard behind the curtain, the wizard who orchestrates things and operates in illusion. But the wizard isn't the worst character. We have Glinda, the good witch, and then we have the wicked witch of the West. We have our heroes and we have our villains. We know who we are supposed to be like, Dorothy, Glinda the Good. We know who we're not supposed to be like, the Wicked Witch. But if you've seen the Broadway play Wicked, we know that there is another side to this story. In the play, Elphaba is not the Wicked Witch of the West. She's been ostracized out of her own control. In that sense, she's like Dorothy. Because of the actions of her parents, she turns out green and is chastised for it all her life. From the margins of society, she learns to look for others on the margins, including the animals of Oz, which is why she seeks to liberate the monkeys. You know, the ones in The Wizard of Oz that caused Dorothy and the gang so much trouble. So what are the stories that make us? The Wizard of Oz tells us we're supposed to be innocent. We're supposed to be repentant, and we can make up for our wrongdoings by ultimately confessing, like the wizard does, being found behind the curtain. But what about the Wicked Witch? Who's there to tell her story? Are there things in the show Wicked that illustrate that by learning and paying attention to other stories, there are things about those who we write off quickly as wicked that might not be so wicked after all? As you read Scripture, as you think about American stories, as people are beginning to think and talk and act against monuments, national heroes, and the stories we tell ourselves, how do we tune in to know that there are always two sides to every story? How do we process them with open eyes, open ears, open hearts, and open minds, so that the stories that make us into the people that we want to be, the people that God calls us to be? So as I'm thinking about stories, I hope you are thinking about stories too this week. And because I like telling a few stories, I have a little more to say. So maybe you can stick around and listen to. I think about the stories that I heard growing up in Texas. I can't tell you how many times I heard that as a Texan, we are Americans, and people need to learn to speak English. But the other side of that story is that Texas comes from a Native American word, combined with Spanish a little bit. We'd say Tejas meaning friendship. So in a state that is itself not an English word, where the word means friendship, we also say that people need to learn English. That causes a little cognitive dissonance for me whenever I think about those stories side by side. That the one thing you're supposed to remember as a Texan is the Alamo, which was a Spanish mission. The great cities of Texas, like San Antonio, are themselves Spanish. And so how do we construct the full picture of that story that in some way shapes who I am as a native Texan, born in San Antonio? My first babysitter was from Guatemala. My first word was agua. How am I supposed to process that as a part of my own history? As I tell you that story, what am I trying to tell you about me? That's a way that stories make who we are. In the stories that we tell, we are trying to explain to ourselves and others just who we are. In Minnesota, the things that I think of are hockey and Paul Bunyan. But Minnesota itself is a Native American word. That in America, we have a history that is not only white, and it's pretty clear that it's not only white. How do we integrate those parts of the American story into our own stories? My own story. That's part of the challenge. Because in a story we have heroes and villains, and we have role models for people that we want to be like and people that we don't want to be like. By revisiting some of those stories, by rethinking the heroes that we've had, that's the way we begin to change who we are, either for good or for ill. And there's a million examples of this. Who is the first casualty of the American Revolution? Some people say it's Crispus Attucks, who was murdered in the Boston Massacre. Maybe he was slave, maybe he was free. He was what people called mulatto, part African, part native. The first casualty of the American Revolution. The first person who paid, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, the last full measure of devotion for America. In what ways does that make Crispus Attucks a founding father, even if his name isn't on the Declaration of Independence? Do we have those images of the things and the people who have shaped America? In our memorials, in our monuments, in the stories that we tell ourselves, there is a lot at stake. Our history is only a part of it. Who we are presently might be the more important part. And as Ecclesiastes tells us, there's a time for building up, and there's a time for tearing down. How do you tear up these stories within yourselves, these parts of your identity that are only parts of a bigger picture? How do you build them anew, or again, to make them better? To better indicate the kind of person who you are or the person that you want to be. If Jesus is about grace and love, that's a particular paraphrase of the gospel story, how do we do that? I've already talked a little bit about God's long summer and how those stories of faith shape 5 people in 5 very different ways. So it's easy to see how these myths, these stories, these fables have shaped us and how they can work for good, how they can work for ill. So what is your story? And how does it fit into a larger story of your family, of your church, of the nation, and of the world? There is a power to stories, a power that shapes us, but there's also power behind the stories. To the victor go the spoils. The chronicles that we have of people who've gone before us, they're generally the ones who've come out on top. It's harder to find the stories of people who have been oppressed or broken or defeated. But that's not to say that those stories don't exist. How do we uncover the stories of who we are, whatever that might mean? How do we know that there are competing stories that vie for power in the world and in our own heads and in our own hearts. That's the task, to listen to who we are and listen to the powers that stories have to shape us. So maybe tonight before you go to bed, you read a really good story and you think about it. That's about all I've mused about this week, but I hope it's something that you can muse about too. Read excellent stories, look for them broadly, read stories from people who are not like you for whatever that might mean. And after you do that, I'll see you next Monday.